Happy Friday morning. Welcome, Flutarians. I'm here welcoming Stephen Clark, the author of The Flute Gem. Thanks so much for joining me. So, I'll just tell you a little bit of the story behind why I wanted to invite you. It seems to be kind of a happy coincidence that the person I'm remembering has a very similar name to you. Stephen Crawford was my one of my high school band directors, and I think one of the most impactful phrases any of my band directors ever said to me was that musicians are small muscle athletes. I think he might have gotten that statement or that idea from Daniel Coyle's book, The Talent Code. But I have told so many people about that I was talking to people about how, well, when you're warming up in the practice room, it's really like being in your own little personal flute gym. And I said some variation of that phrase, and people, so at least one person was like, hey, there's a book, The Flute Gym. And I think the second or third time somebody said that, I was like, I have to figure this out. Who is writing about the Flute Gym? So here we have you. Thanks so much for joining us. I'd be very curious to hear. So what's the origin story on why you chose the title The Flute Gym?
It's actually quite a funny story. There's a whole brass series called the Brass Gym or something like this,
Mm.
which I had no idea about. And then a conductor friend of mine, once the book came out, actually it's about a year after the book, he said to me one day, "Oh, I really want to read this book, because I used to use the brass gym." He was a trumpet player, I think. I used to use the brass gym, and I was like, "There's a brass gym or whatever it's called, trumpet gym." And he thought it was part of the series, and I was like, "No, this is completely coincidence that it's even got the same title." And the publishers and things, no one ever told me. So it's nothing to do with the brass gym. And also, there was someone else who once bought it thinking it was like a workout book for flute players, and I was like, no, like a physical workout book, like just
Right.
exercises in the gym to do it. And I was like, no, it's nothing like that. So the flute gym came about because now currently for the last year I've been teaching full time, although I still play a lot. I'm teaching full time at Northwestern State University,
Mm.
but I came to academia very late in life, really, compared to most. I'm 41 now. But until 2021, just before COVID, I was playing full time. I was touring and traveling, and I was always on the road. And I did teach, but I only taught really one day a month. And it was a very small class of very, very advanced kind of graduate level students who all now are either orchestral players or professional players, very ambitious class. But on the road, when I was traveling all the time, I was playing concert after concert after concert. And as my career got busier and busier, my practice time got less and less because, you're either in the airport or on the plane or then in rehearsal or trying to do like PR stuff, whatever you were told to do for these engagements. So I was desperately trying to keep in shape in my playing. And the ironic thing was, as your schedule got busier and busier with concerts and your fee went higher and higher, my playing was getting worse and worse. This is what I was noticing, and I was really stressed about it. So I realized I had to really change how I practiced because I didn't have all this time, like as a college student, to just spend hours and hours going through fundamentals and going through repertoire and all the stuff that you need to do. Um, so I had to really find ways to make sure that the challenges that I had personally in my playing, I could keep them hidden, if you like,
Mm.
like
Mm-hmm.
as less of a challenge as possible. I always say to my students, we all have weaknesses and we all have strengths. So you have to know both of them. And your weaknesses are probably always going to be your weaknesses, but we have to work to make them less weak. So really it was about finding exercises to like hone in on certain things that I was nervous about or worried were going to interfere in the quality of my performance. So it started out that I was just like catching 5 minutes here or 10 minutes there in a backstage or a dressing room or a restroom, wherever you could find just to practice these little things. And I would come back to Northern Ireland where I was living in London, but I was flying into Northern Ireland to teach this flute class. And I would just like give them little scribbly exercises on like a napkin or the back of an envelope or or sometimes just off my head I'd say, hey, I found this little thing and this really helped me do such and such. And so all my students were playing these little noodly exercises constantly, and they were the ones that were like, one day you should write these down, you should write them down. And I had no aspiration to ever do that, to be honest, because I was very happy doing what I was doing and like helping my students, my very small group of students who I barely saw every so often. So that was kind of fine. And I just had this entire backlog of exercises. I mean, I could have probably written about 5 books full of exercises, is the truth. But then I broke my shoulder. suddenly,
Hmm.
completely unexpectedly, of course, like any injury. I fell off a stage in Norway,
Oh
and
dear.
I know it was a messy time, and I couldn't play for several months, and I was very depressed about it. And I was talking to my friend Carolyn, and I was just sitting on her couch in her living room one day, and I was like, "This is the worst thing. Like, I can't play. I don't know what to do with my life. You know, like I'm so bored." And she was like, "Just write the book. Write that book that your students were always
Hmm.
talking about." And so I was like, "Okay." Like, I had no no kind of like thought about it. I was like, "Yeah, why not?" And it was so naive of me to think this, but I literally the next morning just like got up, put my laptop on my knees, and wrote the book. And I wrote it in about 3 days, because all the exercises were already there. I didn't have to write a single exercise. I just had to write the text that went with it. And the reality is, we spent way more time choosing like the thickness of the paper and the binding and all this kind of stuff
Hmm.
as opposed to writing it. That was what was time consuming. The writing the book was easy. But then initially it was going to be called How to Be a Flute Superhero. The reason being, and
Oh.
I didn't like this title, but the reason being, a few years ago, I think it was 2016 or something, I recorded an album, and the label made this amazing picture of me dressed as Superman. Some people will know this picture I'm talking about. And with the green screen, I mean, it took us a whole day to get this shot, and it was a really cool shot, and it got a lot of attention. Because there was always this thing about Stephen Clark Kent, and I had this like little piece of curly hair that would go,
Ah.
and all this kind of stuff. So we were going to reuse that kind of photograph and make a whole book out of it. And I just didn't think it sounded nice. It sounds so arrogant, like how to be a flute superhero. I would never think of myself as a flute superhero in the slightest. And you know that's reserved for the icons of the flute. So I just didn't really feel comfortable with it. And then like towards the publishing day, the printing day, I was like, we need to make a decision here. And I don't know how the flute gym kind of came up. I just thought it was a kind of quirky name because these are like, I always say to my students, my technical work, my scales and stuff, it's like going to the gym every day. You know, you hate it while
Yeah.
you're doing it, but you feel so good for it afterwards. And these were kind of, although there's only one chapter on scales, everything was just for me like embouchure workouts and stuff like that. But not just to be difficult, to genuinely understand the physicality and the problems that we face as a flute player. Like I really think if you can understand why the problem is happening or why something is difficult, it's a much more direct route to being able to do it better or more successfully. So it just kind of happened. And then I remember saying I really wanted to look like an American college kind of program, like a football program. And of course, I wasn't living in America at the time and I wasn't teaching at college. So they did all the font and stuff. And it does kind of look very American, actually. And I don't know if this is a PG show or not, but I could tell you a horrible story about this
Oh,
picture. But
please. I think it's all adults in my group. So.
okay, so the artist for this kind of cartoon thing, um, it all had to be done really quick because I changed my mind about what I wanted it to be called. So I don't know what they did. I just found this picture online, like Google Images of some guy weightlifting, literally dressed in this like gray tank top and the shorts. And I said to them, "Hey, what about if it was like this, but it was my face and then it had like a flute instead of the barbell?" And they went, "Yeah, fine, no problem." And they obviously had some kind of program that takes like the picture I sent them and like cartoonifies it, and then you know what I mean. They didn't necessarily draw this, and it was all being rushed so much at the end because the name changed and we had to get it to print. What I didn't notice is that in the picture, like one of the guy's testicles was hanging out. So we all looked at this picture and we were like, "Yeah, that's awesome, that's great," and we all approved it. And then I was just sitting looking at it, and it was like 4 minutes before like 20,000 copies were being printed, and I was like, "Stop!" And they had to go back and change that. But we were minutes away, like
That's
literally minutes
hysterical.
away from having the first run, which was the biggest run of this book, with you know bits and pieces that we can't use. So
Moral of the story: double
yeah,
check with your your
quadruple
image
check,
designer. Quadruple check.
quadruple
Get
check.
your
Yeah,
friends and family to check. That's
I
funny.
actually still have it somewhere. I have like the
The
render of that
image, yeah.
picture, and one day I will show the world that picture.
Well, I love the image. I think it's silly, and it demonstrates a good point. I can see how people, if they were just shopping at Flute Center or whatever, if they just glance at this, they might think it's a workout book for flutists, which I guess from some perspective it is. Um,
You know, the other thing about the picture is the first time it was ever reviewed, which was in the British Flute Society Journal. Um, I was very nervous about the review, but it was a glowing review. I was really delighted. But one thing it did say, that the only negative thing it said was that the front cover gives this impression that it's the kind of frivolous, fun, like not serious
Oh,
flipping,
it's
which is not what it is
serious.
at all. It's completely the opposite. So I was like, maybe that was a mistake that we did, but also I needed something to stand out.
Hmm.
And I remember going into Jonathan Mile Just Flutes in London and going to their massive sheet music selection and just looking, and the only color I couldn't see was like blue and red. Didn't seem to be on anything. So that's why we went with it, because we wanted it to stand out, and it does stand out. I mean, it's done exactly what we wanted it to do. But I do appreciate that perhaps it gives this impression that it's a bit of a lighter book than it actually is.
I was just going to briefly show y'all that it does have QR codes. When you buy this book, it's kind of like buying a video course as well, because Stephen goes through and explains each of the exercises and gives a little demonstration of them as well. So that's really nice. I appreciate that you did that.
Yeah, and that was a bit ahead of its time, I think, when we did that. I mean, it's not. We've had this book out quite a few years now. It was quite ahead of its time, and I remember people thinking that'll never work, and I was thinking, will it not? But it does work actually. I think there's lots of people kind of using that idea now, and I think it's a good way to do it.
Hmm. There's there was a time in my life where I kind of graduated beyond scales books. Not that I don't continue to practice scales, but that I rarely, if ever, continue to practice with sheet music in front of me. And so there's a part of me that when I look at buying a new book like this, I'm like, oh, so much paper for all of those scales that I'm probably never going to read directly from the page except the first couple of times.
Yeah, I
But
say I'm sure I say that in the beginning of the scale chat. Like these have to be internalized. This isn't about reading them from the page. They're there as the guide, but really, I strongly believe that if you don't have your scales internalized, there's zero point to knowing them.
mm. Well, one of the
Because
things I noticed about you is that you have a little chapter on the back about memorization and how that can improve our performance as musicians.
yeah, and I mean, this entire book is my practice plan on tour. That's all it is,
Mm.
formalized into a book. And when I was playing full time, I memorized everything. I had no choice. I mean, you have to. Every recital, every concerto. And the only time I didn't play from memory was orchestrally. Um, and there were weeks where I would have to play two different concertos and two different recital programs all within 7 days and like three different continents, all from memory. It was really
Wow.
challenging. That's the hardest part. So a lot of people were coming to me at the time and still do now and saying, "Oh, I can't memorize." And I would talk to them about it for 5 minutes, and I'd be like, "But you've never really given yourself a chance, because it's difficult, and everything that's difficult isn't going to go great at the beginning. You have to be willing to fail. You have to be willing to go through the journey of figuring out how it gets better. Like what you did at the beginning of your flute playing. If you played your first few notes and you thought, well, that doesn't sound so good, I'm never going to be good at this, then you would never have practiced. You have to practice memorizing to get better at memorizing. It's a skill like, being able to play an octave is, or being able to control your dynamics, or any of this stuff, or your finger work. So I get a bit frustrated with people when they're like, "Oh yeah, I tried to play from memory and it didn't go very well, so I don't think I can memorize that." You just are, it's easy for you, or you have this skill that I don't have, and it's such a lot of rubbish. Anyone can learn to memorize, but they have to be willing to put the work in to memorize, and that means they have to be willing for it to go badly a couple of times, in fact, several hundred times, before it actually starts to go well. So I wanted to talk about that in the book. I think people think there's a magic trick to memorizing, and if there is, I have yet to discover it. Um, but I do think I can share some experience of why I played from memory, why it was so imperative, and also the process I used to get comfortable with it. But the bottom line is nothing is ever going to be a substitute for experience.
Yeah, the word that's coming to mind when you're talking about that is cumulative. It's cumulative experience, and one of the things I like about that book, The Talent Code, is they talk about this idea of the 10,000 hour rule, and it doesn't matter if you're a professional gymnast or a professional flutist. That if you've dedicated 10,000 hours to your craft, you're almost certainly an expert by that point. But when we talk about something like improvisation or memorization, of course your first few hundred minutes or hours of it are going to be just like our first few hundred minutes or hours of learning to walk or do any other physical
Exactly.
skill when we're children. We're gonna be like little children when we do it at first.
Yeah, you'll fall over straight away.
Yeah.
I mean, and the 10,000 hour thing is an interesting concept. Personally, I think it's not enough. I think it takes way
Mm.
more than 10,000 hours. way more, like maybe 40,000 hours. Um, so, I mean that, and of course, everyone is so individual. There is no one solution to anything, and some of my colleagues can pick things up much quicker than I can, and there's certain things that I can do and pick it up quicker from them. And it all comes down to experience. For example, some of my colleagues who haven't played so much from memory, but are the most incredible musicians, maybe would take longer to memorize a Mozart concerto than I might take because I've played it so many times from memory already. It's just a case of revisiting and kind of refreshing. But there are things that they would do, like the orchestral repertoire. They might, I didn't play an orchestra for 9 years. I just took a 9 year break from it entirely, and then only a couple of years ago went back to doing orchestral work. So there's still a lot of pieces that I have never played, especially now living in America where the repertoire is a little different. Whereas they might have played a lot of these American composer things 20 times already, and I'm seeing it for the first time on the stand. So we all have different strengths, and that's absolutely fine. Doesn't mean that you're less worthy or more worthy than anyone else, but you have to approach it from your perspective to make that weakness better, irrelevant of what everyone else is doing. So memorization is a big topic. And it's funny, I get asked to do a lot of classes on it, and I'm always like, no, I don't really want, I have nothing to say about it. I don't think there is a magic trick. If there is, I just don't know it. It's just a case of learning one note, and then once you got one note, learning two notes, and once you got two notes, learning three notes. And you have to, like, the other thing is it takes longer. It takes a lot longer to learn a piece from memory than it does to learn it with the music in front of you. So I don't understand how I can give a class on that. I mean, I've told you everything I know already. you know?
Yeah, just do it, like Nike would
Yeah,
say.
just do it.
When you're
Take
saying that,
it.
it reminds me of some of the ideas and trains of thought I've been going down as I've been trying to figure out, well, gosh, how can I create an online program that actually helps people improve their improvising? Because really, I'm teaching a little bit of technique and doing a lot of mindset coaching, creating a safe place for people to practice. So you could have a room full of people who are practicing together at the same time, supporting each other and memorizing it note by note. But that's what you do. You just start with one measure, then add another measure, and different people will learn it at different paces. One of my favorite things about your book was this idea of using intonation and outtonation. You have a simple little melody there that has all seven notes of the major scale in it, and you can really do this with any melody that you have memorized. In fact, I would encourage those of you who are watching to do so. And the idea is basically you push your head joint all the way in, play it along with the drone, and if you're sharp, well, you do something other than move the head joint to fix it as best you can.
It's possibly the most useful skill I can tell people that want to play with other people at high level. Um, when I'm coaching
Mm.
university orchestras, youth orchestras, or whatever, and I'll do a sectional rehearsal or something, and I'll say, "Hey, you're sharp or you're flat. Can you hear it?" If there's pushing and pulling in their head joint, I'm like, you can't do that in real life. I mean, sometimes you can, but the majority of the time, there's no time to start
Mm-hmm.
changing flute. And also, more importantly, it's a team game playing with other people. And if someone else is having some issues with their intonation, your job is to hide that. You have to play in a way that makes sure that the clarinets don't sound sharp or the bassoons don't sound sharp.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
You know what I mean? So you have to do that with embouchure. You have to be able to do it with embouchure, but it's something we don't really practice. We practice flexibility a lot, really the movement of big intervals, which is important as well. But we never practice really being able to adjust intonation to the extent that you really need to do it in the real world. So that's where the outtonation thing came from. I
And
mean, I made the name outtonation up just when I was writing the book. It wasn't something I'd said.
and outtonation mostly meaning just pull your head joint out more
Well, not
than
necessarily, not
okay.
necessarily pull it out, just like be out of tune, be deliberately out of tune with the where the pitch is. So you have to practice it both ways actually. So first of all, take the melody with the drone and tune to the drone perfectly. So let's say the drone is on the A. You tune your flute to the A and it's perfectly in tune, and then you play the melody and you should be in tune with the drone. But then deliberately be out of tune with the drone. So play again and make yourself really flat or really sharp, but then when you play the melody, still make it sound in tune because you're doing it all with embouchure, and that's outtonation.
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't really mean anything, intonation and outtonation, but it's a really important skill because you have to be able to bend the pitch like
Mm-hmm.
that, And of course, certain notes are more problematic than others, which is why on almost every chapter with the different melodies, I put it in every different key, because if you're playing something that's got a ton of C sharps in it, the C sharp is going to be naturally sharp. But if you're playing a thing with a ton of middle E flats, then it's going to naturally be flat. So the positioning and the movement we have to do is so completely different from key to key.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's really an ear training exercise more than any. Well, it's definitely a physical training exercise, but also an ear training exercise, because certainly when I'm playing in the orchestra or in chamber music or something, I often can't predict what's going to happen. I mean, if there's a ton of C sharps
Sure.
on your page, you can't. But I can't really predict what everyone else is going to be doing. I just have to be listening like crazy and adjusting so quickly that nobody notices. I mean, I always say to my students here, the best orchestras in the world, like the Berlin Phil, for example, they all play out of tune all the time. Like when that chord starts, bang, the wind are not together, they're not in tune, but they adjust it so much quicker than everybody else. That's why they're the best
Mm-hmm.
orchestra.
Mm.
So it's so much as like guesswork. Like I think it's going to be here and I'm going to place it here, but then being so reactive to what's happening that if it's not in the right place, you change it so quickly that the person listening never knew it wasn't in the right place to begin with. And that gives the impression, I call it the oral illusion. I talk a lot here, creating an oral illusion of something, but it gives the impression of something being perfect. But it's not, it's a lot of work and a lot of quick thinking and quick moving to make it sound like that. So that's the outtonation exercise. It's something I'd never really seen anyone do before. Um, and I mean, I was just doing it, in my own personal practice, just to really be as flexible as I can. I thought it was a really quick way of practicing flexibility, and it works really nicely.
Sure.
And so I stuck it in the book, really. But
Well,
also, we're of that time now where like my iPhone has a drone on it, 10 years ago that probably wouldn't happen. So we can just have it with us all the time.
Well, I just wanted to grab my flute and show the physical aspect of, well, you could have it, the head joint in super extreme or out super extreme, and the idea is here is that when you start playing, to actually do whatever you need to get it in tune. I've had this experience playing with singers, for example. We start in one key, and they don't realize that their pitch is dropping and dropping and dropping as they sing the song, and I don't have a moment usually to just to adjust my head joint. That's impractical at that moment. I get this image when I think about throwing a note for intonation of like throwing a dart versus like a paintbrush stroke. So when we just like throw an A out there and we're hoping to make an A440, it's like we're throwing a dart at a bullseye. But in these realistic scenarios, when it's a band or symphony or whatever, it's just like they throw it in that general direction, and our embouchures are so flexible that within a half a second or whatever, you've been able to move that paintbrush up to where it needs to be or down to where it needs to be. And it's great to hear you talk about that. Um,
I actually
even
love the
professionals, yeah.
I love the dartboard analogy. I say that as well. I
Oh,
say,
cool.
you got to get right in the bullseye. The problem is the bullseye's moving.
Mm.
So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a great analogy to use. Um, but I think there's this, for younger players especially, or maybe less experienced players, there's this kind of incorrect myth where they think it's about you play your A or your B flat, whatever you're tuning to, and once it's in tune, everything should be perfect. And of course, that's just not the case in the slightest. I mean, I actually think sometimes tuning up's pointless.
Yeah.
We already roughly know where it's going to be, because we do it all the time. And sure, sometimes we go in and the piano's out of tune, or the orchestra's playing higher or lower, whatever, and we're in a slightly different place than normal. But almost always, it's not really a surprise. So for me, I say to my students, when you tune with your A to the piano, for example, it doesn't actually have to be perfect. You just have to know where you are and then go from there. And certainly, I don't like to tune when I walk on stage to play a recital. It depends on the first piece, but almost always I'll just walk on and play the first piece. I roughly know where I am, and I'll be adjusting and be listening. And then I might take an A after the first piece. I just think it kind of kills the moment with the audience if you walk out and thank you so much for being here. Like,
Yeah.
and also the amount of time that some people take to tune up. I mean, this is how I teach my students to tune up. This is the length of time. Yeah. That's all I need to know. I hear the A, I hear my A. Is it the same? Is it not the same? That's all I need to know.
I heard zero A there. I could see your
Oh,
mouth move.
sorry.
It's all good. It's probably
This
the
is
original
how long
sounding.
the A is. So the piano goes A, and I go done.
Okay.
That's all I think you need to hear. And anything longer than that is kind of a waste of time and irrelevant, actually. But that's just my opinions on it.
I'm personally of the preference that why not just make it a little improvised prelude, even if it's just a arpeggio up and down. It gives people something nice to listen to, and gives you a little bit longer to actually hear what is the accompaniment. Where are they at right now?
But don't you think it kind of like detracts from the music of what's to follow? That's my
I
concern.
I I can see how that could be a concern. Yeah, I think it. I think personally, if you're going to play something that's in, well, whatever key it's in, it would be more practical to play a little bit of that chord that it starts on than to just do an A, especially if it's in a closely related key, like or close to it. I mean, like you're about to play something in B flat or in B. It's probably not the wisest to meditate on A for a few
Yeah,
seconds.
I can understand that. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, each to their own, and everyone has to do what they think is correct. And certainly, if you think it's going to make you play better to take some time and do a little noodle around in the key, fine, go for it. For me, I just really want I want the first piece to be impactful, and I don't want them to have had like a little mini piece before it. Because I've seen people do it where it's very successful. Like Galway, for example, when he was giving recitals, and I used to see them all the time. I was one of his students. He would come out and he would do this like little improvisation thing, and it would go on for maybe, I don't know, like 10, 15 seconds, and the audience would clap, and he would take a bow, like he just played it. As part of his character and part of his persona and charm on stage. But I don't know. I'm quite traditional in that sense, and I'm not James Galway. I don't have the same relationship with an audience that he does. He's in a very unique situation there. Uh, but I think everyone has to do what's right for them. There is absolutely no right or wrong to any of this, and I say constantly when I'm teaching, this is just my ideas. You're allowed to completely ignore it. I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. But we have to select our ideas not by what is right or wrong, but what we think is good or bad. Right or wrong is too influential in our decision making. Sorry, not right or wrong. Easy or difficult is what I'm trying to say here. If something is easy, we think, oh, I'm going to do it. And if something's difficult, we say, oh no, that can't be good. But actually, that's not true. Easy or difficult should never be the reasons we make a decision on something. It needs to be much more thoughtful than that, I think.
Mm. I liked how you were explaining earlier that this book came out of what you needed to do personally just to stay in your best flute shape. So I think this book is a good guide for anyone who's especially been playing for a couple of years, maybe not to an advanced player yet, and you're looking for things to really hone your craft. But it's also good for anyone who's looking for a few things to keep you in shape, even if you've only got 5 or 10 minutes before your show or whatever you've got going on next.
Yeah, I think so. Like you could, it's funny because when I wrote the book, I never intended it to be practiced from cover to cover. That was never my intention at all. I just wrote all these exercises about all these different problems, and people can dip in and out in what they want, which is what I was doing in it, and still what I do in it. But some people are writing to me going, "Really love this book. It takes me like 1 hour to get through from start to finish or whatever." And I'm like, "Wow, that's not what I intended. But if it's working for you, that's great." Um, I mean, like there's like the articulation chapter, for example. I don't practice that very much. It's not something I ever feel I have a problem with. But if I sometimes I'm like, oh, that wasn't very good in rehearsal today, then I'll immediately revisit the articulation chapter and fix my double tonguing or whatever. But I think it's about going through it and thinking, what do I want to get better at? And also, there's a lot of text in this book. I went into a lot of detail and tried to explain the problems that we have in a very matter of fact way. Like support, for example. I think we're taught support in a very poor way, generally speaking. Mainly because I don't think people really understand what it actually is. And I mean, I
Mm.
don't really understand what it is. And when I wrote the book, I contacted 5 or 6 medical professionals, all of whom played wind instruments at quite a high level. One was a surgeon, one was a GP, one was like a ear, nose, and throat specialist, one was like I don't know, all these people, I forget what they all did now. We had this little, it wasn't Zoom back then, it was a Skype call back then, before Zoom was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we spoke about it, and the only thing we could agree on is that support is important. None of these absolute medical experts who are also very good wind players, mostly flute, but not all, could actually come to a consensus of what exactly support is. And I thought that was fascinating. Yet all these flute teachers who have never done any medical training in their life are saying, from the diaphragm. But we all know it's not the diaphragm. We know 100% it's not the diaphragm. We can all agree on that. But because that's what we're taught, we just continue to say it. We never question it. And therefore, we pass terrible information onto our students. So whenever I hear the diaphragm word said, I mean, I roll my eyes inside. I'm like, we are failing our students if we mention the word diaphragm, because the flute has zero to do with diaphragm and anything. There's not a single moment the diaphragm is involved in flute playing, but we still say it because it's easy, you know. But why actually do we not just tell them the truth, which is just as simple an idea, but actually is correct, you know? So I had to kind of really think about these things. So I think in a way the book is, that's for me the thing I'm most proud about, and the thing that I think makes this book most unique is I don't think there's another book in existence that goes into the detail of the mechanics of the flute. And actually what the air is doing to create sound, and therefore how we have to manipulate that, or what the how do we get velocity in our fingers? You know, that's something we don't speak about. How do we get speed? We talk about accuracy all the time, but how do we get speed? And intonation. Why is something in tune or out of tune, and why are harmonics important in the flute? All this kind of stuff. So I just think it's very literal. I think it's just kind of, here's how the flute works. Here's what our body needs to do. The physical side of it, let's make that happen. So I kind of like that about it, and it's very much how I teach as well. You know, like, if you can just do this with the embouchure, this is going to happen with the air, and therefore this is the result of the sound. You know, the big one in the book that I go on and on about is the difference between airspeed and quantity of air.
Mm-hmm. I have that part highlighted for sure.
Yeah, I think I have it in bold, and the first time it's made. No one had ever said that to me, and I was probably like late 20s when I actually discovered what each of those things do. You know, what happens when we change the speed? What happens when we change the quantity? Because I hear a lot of people talking about air pressure constantly. Air pressure, and this is pointless. Air pressure is a mix of both of those things. It's not actually helping anyone. Like, maybe it's an idea, but what about if we actually separate it out into the two strands of what the air can actually do, and what each control, which is a completely different thing, and therefore how we're able to change that in our own playing to get a better result, if that makes any sense at all.
Well, I'm trying to boil it down into the shortest version of it, which I guess is the volume of air relates to the volume of sound that's coming out, and the speed of air is related to the pitch, which brings me back to, I love the fact that you're incorporating harmonics and using the voice, because singing and playing at the same time, the harmonics is a great way to train like the direction of the airstream, but also to discover what is the exact speed that I need for this exact note on the flute.
Exactly. I think you've just explained it so well. The other thing that I really like about harmonics, and it's something that we don't talk about in the flute really, unless you're testing out head joints, is resistance. You know, like when people are testing out head joints, like, oh, I really don't like this one, it's too resistant, or I really like the resistance in this one. And I'm not really interested in that so much, but what I am interested in is how when you play a harmonic, it creates resistance. And back in 2017, which was a few years before I wrote the book, I wanted to do a marathon, right? Just run a marathon once in my life. I mean, it was not fun. It was a very unpleasant experience, actually. But I spent like 6 months training for this thing, and I ran the marathon. And towards the end, where we were in like up to the 20-mile training runs, there was a little club of runners that used to go out, like really experienced runners. And I noticed some of them would like have weights or like a little backpack with some stuff in it, and they would go running with the weights. And then when it came to the race day, they would take the weights off, and you know, they had no resistance anymore, and they could like fly. They could go at 100 miles an hour instead of this like hard work. And for me, that is actually the most useful thing that we can do with harmonics. Is it provides us resistance to, I don't like the word push, but you know, to work against. So that if we can control everything that we want to control under this umbrella of resistance of the harmonic, when we take the harmonic away and we go back to the real fingering and the resistance is gone, we can fly. You know, like everything is more open, the sound is more focused, the control that we have is much more accurate because we've been working against it for so long, and then we take it away and it's so much easier. That for me is the most useful thing I can do with harmonics. I know there's this exercise where everyone builds up the harmonic series, and that's fine, and there's definitely gain in that because of the angle that you have to play at and also the precision. But really I find using harmonics to provide resistance changed my flute sound entirely
Mm.
for the better.
That's a great point. I love that you were talking about carrying stones, or the idea of doing something difficult in our practice time so that when it comes go time for performance time, we can do it with ease. And that resistance that you're talking about too is actually one of the main reasons I would recommend to any concert flute player that you spend at least just a few minutes with a Bansuri flute or any style of side blown wooden flute, because they don't have all the gizmos and the bohem system that make it easy to move across the registers. And so if you want to play the higher notes at all, you have to overblow. And so when you come back to your concert flute after just a few minutes of that experience, I think you'll find, oh, like I'm more flexible, I'm more warmed up, literally warmed up, like being in the gym. um, I'm glad to hear you've had some experience with training for something big physically like a marathon. I As we're talking about your book, I'm thinking about friends of mine I know who are athletes, and how the things that they do in the gym are not necessarily the things that they do in performance. Just like the things that you do in your book and your personal warm up are things that you don't do in performance. I mean, most of us are not playing, singing and playing at the same time, or playing a lot of harmonics in our music. That's just not part of the classical repertoire until you get into some of the newer stuff. However, using it in your workout routine has all these side benefits that come out when we're playing classical
No,
music.
Vic, you're 100% correct, and I've never thought of it like that before, but you're so right. I am not practice. Most of my practice is not what people hear in public.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my practice is keeping me not just at the level I am, but to try and get better than that level, you know. There's two kinds of practice. I talk about this a lot with my students, because it's really important once you get to this kind of level where you're being paid to play and you have to maintain a high level, and also time is so limited. You've got maintenance practice and you've got progressive practice. Sometimes we have to practice, all we have time for is practice to maintain our current standard, because if we don't do it, we get worse, there's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the best kind of practice is that we get better than our current standard. So tomorrow's standard is better than today's. But to do that, the majority of your practice is not what the public are going to hear. It's exercises, etudes, studies, scales, tone work, flexibility work in particular is important, all this kind of stuff. And that's a really interesting concept that I've never quite thought of it quite like that before, but you're absolutely right. It's just like an athlete. You might get a diver, for example, whose competition, they're competing in the Olympics to win a medal of diving, but I bet they spend more time in the gym.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure of it.
Honing the particular muscles that they need to use. And then, of course, tons of time on the diving board as well,
Mm-hmm.
which is just as important for flute playing, tons of time on the repertoire. But there's so much else that goes into it to play at the highest level. Now, there are tons of players who don't do that, of course, and it seems to be okay for them. But my teachers, who I regard as the greatest players in the world, one in particular who I would say is the greatest player that ever lived, that's all he ever did. And we would just learn so much from listening to him practice, and especially what would he practice. He played these he would play these pieces all the time for years and years. He didn't need to spend forever practicing them anymore. He still practiced them, of course, but he was obsessive about sound and technique and how to get better. And even at 75, he must have been. I remember one lesson where he came running into the room so excited one morning with the class, and he went, "Guys, I figured it out. I know how to breathe. I figured out breathing." And we're like, I think you knew how to breathe before because you've been doing this for a long time, but you had just discovered this massive thing at 75 about, it was to do with support, actually, really, when I think back. But loads of times he would do that. I've really made progress on single tonguing, and I was like, how are you still thinking like this when you're at this level already? But that's all he ever did, and we'd be playing etudes constantly, exercises constantly, scales constantly, noodling out his own exercises for himself because he wanted to get better at something. He didn't stand and practice his Mozart concerto that much. I mean, he did, because he had to play it night after night, but really, there's so much more to it. I think you've just hit the nail on the head, actually.
Well, it's remarkable that we can continue to play flute into our 70s and 80s, but in order to do so, we need to maintain a certain amount of flute fitness. Just like if a gymnast wants to continue to be able to do a flip into their 70s and 80s, they have to maintain at least, a 30-minute or an hour a day sort of maintenance plan, you might say. I'm remembering a joke I made a few weeks or a few months ago where I said that being able to play a low C on the flute without a warm up is like being able to do a splits without a warm up. You're either a pro or a freak of nature.
Mm. Yeah,
like
that's a hard thing.
I
You know
think
what
of my
else?
friends who are gymnasts, like professional gymnasts or dancers, and I see them at the gym and they just pop out a split, and I'm like, oh my god, I can't even do a split, and I'm like spending these minutes during the week just to even approach being able to have that level of mastery. But on flute, low C, no problem anymore. Unless low B, sometimes though, I still need to give myself the chance to relax into it. That may be my lazy right pinky finger, but that's another story for another day.
You know, there's
Yeah.
also this attitude. I've heard it a few times where people are like, "Oh, practicing technique is not good because it like detracts away from being expressive and musical. You know, it turns you into a
Mm.
machine rather than a human." I actually 100% disagree because if we can build on our technique, and by technique I don't just mean fingers, I mean all of this stuff as well, and the sound work. If we can build on that, we first of all stretch our boundaries of imagination. So things that were not possible before are now within the realm of possibility, which makes us a far more interesting musician to listen to. But also, if we're practicing these mundane things, I don't find them mundane, I kind of love that, it's my favorite part of practice, but mundane things, musically and expressively, if we can take a study, an Anderson study, a Kohler study, a Boehm study, which sometimes are really fun and interesting, but sometimes are dull, if we can make them sound amazing and beautiful and expressive and like the greatest piece of music that's ever been played, then we go to our Bach sonata and suddenly we take it from here and it goes to here. So I 100%, 100,000% disagree with that way of thinking. I think to practice the non-repertoire stuff expressively and beautifully and musically is about as beneficial as you can get in what we do.
Mm. Love what you were saying about taking something even that may be just technical or boring or both, um, and make it musical. Give it
And
a
sometimes that's
direction.
hard work.
It
So, you
is.
know, I remember like for the last few years I've been asked to record the All-State Studies for Texas, which are really
Mm-hmm.
hard, by the way, sometimes.
Sure,
This
I'm
year I
from
might have to.
Texas. Yeah, I have that
Okay.
book right over here, and some of them are technical and not very interesting, and you got to work hard to give it a
Last
little.
year's in particular, I thought were poor choices, and I still
Oh.
recorded them. Oh, I don't mind saying that. I don't work in Texas. I thought they were terrible choices, and I don't think they were fair because it was just going to be a scramble for any player to get through them. What are you
Mm.
actually learning listening to a young kid play these things, other than trying to be mean to them and trying to, like pull the rug from out of them, like to catch them out. It doesn't make any sense to me. Anyway, not my decision. But I recorded them, and I can't remember. I think there were a couple of cardinal lyrics and something else, and one of them in particular, I was like, "This is a really dull thing." There's not much music in this. So you have to work hard, and you have to explore different ways to think, what can I do to make it sound more interesting? How can I change the color? How can I take a little bit of time? And that's a very kind of paint by colors way of approaching it. It's not really how I like to play. I like to more rely on a little bit of heart more than anything else. But sometimes you have to do that. You have to make the goal to provide something interesting. And hopefully that you don't have to do it quite so matter of fact all the time, but sometimes you have to. So it's a good skill to have when you need to do it.
You explained earlier a little bit of the origin story, and I'm curious if when you came back to playing flute after a couple of months off because of your broken shoulder, um, did you what was that experience like? Did you discover, well, I don't know, for me, I went through a period of burnout, and when I came back to flute, it was easy for me to correct what had been a kind of smiley embouchure before. I'd been figuring it out before, but after taking a long period off, it was like a fresh palette. So I'm curious if you experienced anything like that when you came back.
I did, actually. I mean, it was quite an emotional time coming back. I remember, well, first of all, once I was allowed to go back to work, I came out to the US to do a little recital tour through New York and New York State and DC and places like that. And I was still in a lot of pain at intermissions, and I was taking a lot of painkillers to get through second half. So then I went back to the UK, and I went back to the doctor, and they kind of did more tests and scans and things, and they suggested some extra surgery at that point and said you're probably not going to regain the stamina that you had. You have to be ready for that and consider a new career kind of thing. They were wrong, thankfully, but I believed them for a while, but they were wrong. So after a couple more months of physical therapy and all the other stuff, I didn't want the surgery. I went back to play, and I'm trying to think where I was. I think I was in Italy, but I can't really remember. I mean, I can visualize this concert because I remember getting really like emotional on the stage, thinking, "Don't cry." And I never cry. I'm not a crier, but I remember standing on stage because everything was fine again. You know, I felt like I wasn't in pain on stage. I was playing well, and I remember talking, like saying something to the audience about what we were playing, but I wasn't. I mean, I talk to every audience, but I'm saying the same thing every night most of the time, so I wasn't really concentrating on it, you know. And I remember thinking to myself, I was like, "You're back," you know, "You're back."
I'm back.
And it was a very emotional time, but no one knew I was feeling like that on the stage. But then, of course, COVID hit, like very much a month or two later, and then everything changed, and then we had to deal with all the emotions that came with not being able to work because of that. But I think it wasn't good for my playing. I can't say like breaking a shoulder was good for my playing, but it did allow me to reassess what I wanted to sound like, because when you're just playing concerts every night, you actually have to be very careful about changing things, because if you change something normally when you change something, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, we're talking about embouchure stuff. So you can't do that if people are paying you to be on stage.
Right.
You have to provide the goods every night. So when COVID hit, actually, and I had an even longer spell of time off, you know, playing publicly, because in the UK we were in lockdown for nearly 2 years where we weren't allowed to do anything. And I had like 400 concerts cancelled over 2 years during that time.
Wow.
And I remember in the summer of the first year of COVID lockdown, I did a big embouchure change, because I was always very paranoid about having a cleaner sound. When I was at college many moons ago, one of my teachers used to give me a really hard time about air around the sound. He used to tell me it sounded like I was frying bacon, and whenever I would play it would make him hungry, which is funny. I laugh about it now, but it really messed with my head back then. You know, it wasn't done in kindness, it was done in kind of bitchiness. That's just what he was like. He's the only teacher I ever had that was like that. But it made me very paranoid, and it's still something that's with me today, you know, like about the cleanliness of my sound. But in an effort to keep it clean, as I was traveling and playing, I was finding I was rolling in more and more and more and more and more. But the problem with that was, sure, it made the sound laser beam clean, but it was making me flatter and flatter and flatter. So I was pushing in and pushing in and pushing in. And I remember one particular concert, I think it was in South Africa, where the piano was just a little sharper than I would have liked, and I was fully pushed in, and I was still looking up. And at the end of the concert, I was literally in pain of having to just lift up for nearly 2 hours, you know. So I always had it in the back of my mind, I really want to get to the bottom of this and fix it. And I remember during COVID, we weren't allowed to do anything. And a friend of mine, Sally, came around to play duets. We weren't supposed to do it, but we just stood miles away. We just needed to play. Only time we ever broke the law like that. Broke the rules. And I said to her, I was like, I want to change my embouchure. Do you think I sound flat? And she went, no. She said, but it does sound like you're playing quite quiet all the time. And of course, that was another like side effect of rolling in. Sally, by the way, wasn't just a random flute player. She was the associate principal flute of the Cape Town Philharmonic, and she just moved to the UK, so she was a really high level player. I really trusted her, you know. Still is a very high level player. So I was like, she left my house, and I was like, okay, tomorrow's the day one of trying to figure this out. So I took some nail polish and I painted 2 lines on my flute, which are still there, to force myself to roll it out.
You need the prim liner.
There you go. Like people that don't want to mark their flutes are a bit nuts. Anyway, so I made me roll out of it, and it sounded just absolutely dreadful for like several weeks. You know, I had to really force it, really force it. I mean, not force the sound, force myself not to give in and roll in. And I just went back to basics, fundamentals, you know, long tones, which isn't something I practice that much of actually. Like more of the stuff in my book, like putting it into a melody, I think is more useful. Anyway, I did it, and then that went on for probably about 6 months, and then I started to feel comfortable. And then there was one concert that had been cancelled, but instead of cancelling completely, they put it to a closed recording session kind of thing. So they were going to film us play the recital, but with no audience. And there's a video that kicks about on my social media and on YouTube of me playing a flute and piano version of Prélude à l'après-midi d'un Fond by Debussy with my friend Ashley, and that was the first piece I played having changed my embouchure. And I remember when I listened to the live stream of the concert, which was like streamed, I don't know, a month later after we filmed it, I was really pleased with how it sounded. And I don't often like my own playing, but I was really pleased with how it sounded, and I could really see the benefits of what I'd done in my embouchure. But it was, so in a way, like having the time off was horrible, but it was a gift in a way, because if I was continuing to work, I wouldn't have been able to do that. I just couldn't have done it. You know, you have to play every night. And now I still catch myself rolling in. I have to be very careful.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that answers your question necessarily, but
Totally.
I think definitely time off is an opportunity to rethink things. I mean, I've never had any pain when I play, thankfully, but I was very aware that I had to be careful of my shoulder when I came back. And the first few months, it was just weakness, you know, because the muscles hadn't been used like they were being used.
Mm-hmm.
But it was definitely more of an opportunity to fix some things here that I wanted to do, and that's kind of fun. And I say that to my college students, you know, you're never going to have this opportunity ever again in your life. So use it, use it, use it, use it. And if there's something we need to fix, let's really fix it. Fix it now, because you will thank me one day later. You'll thank yourself one day later.
Yeah. Well, I think I love how you were describing the reality of, well, if you're already performing, then you don't really have a lot of room to experiment with a radical change like that, because if your sound is fuzzy tomorrow and the director hates it, well, that's not good. So sometimes we need this distance from recitals and stuff. I think about some of the college age flute players that I've known, and they're already in that position of, I've got this concert and this recital coming up. I can't do something that's going to ruin my embouchure for 3 months and going to make me... They think it's a ruin it, which, I mean, we're too hard on ourselves generally with the language, but yeah.
It's a true thing, you know, like, we feel that concerts are the most important thing that we do. And they are, to some extent, but not at college level. You're not being paid for it. Certainly the first few years of them, it's not really making any difference to your degree, but it takes so much courage to be willing to change things, you know. And so many freshmen, for example, will come in and I'm like, we need to do a little work on your embouchure, you know, maybe they've come from more of a band method or whatever, and you know, to be a really serious flute player, there are certain things that have to happen. I mean, having said that, there are people that play with really wacky embouchures and it works amazingly for them, you know, and they can play incredibly well. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. But there's some very quick exercises you can do to see if something is going to work or not. So I think it really does take courage from the student to be willing to change something. And I have so much respect for the people that are. But I completely understand the people that are resistant to it as well, because it makes playing publicly very difficult and very stressful. So, you know, I don't know the exact answer to it. All I can ever do is offer my opinion and offer my advice and support, and really hope that what they want they manage to achieve, you know.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to share a little bit with us about your book, about your story. I got the book from the Flute Center, thanks to Kimberly in the chat saying she got hers from Carolyn Nussbaum as well. Thanks for tuning in, Chris and Kimberly.
And I got mine from Flute World.
Okay.
Because I don't actually own the book anymore. The distributor is not me anymore, so it's not been for several years. So when I want a copy, I have to buy it like everybody else.
I've got a question coming in from Kim. Kim Hart, if you want to come off of mute and ask your question, go ahead.
Oh, sure.
Hey, Stephen, how are you?
Hi, good. How are you doing?
Got a new little grandbaby, his first Zoom, so
Wow.
I chose well to listen to you talk about rubbish. Anyway, thanks for being on this session. I really get so much out of listening to you, so I really appreciate it. I just want to say hey.
Oh, my pleasure. Nice to see you. I like your artwork behind you. Is that a big painting?
This is my daughter's house. She's got a great eye.
Wow, it's beautiful. I like it a lot.
Oh, well, welcome to the grandbaby, new addition to the family. Keep us in the loop. The up and coming generation of musicians or artists are here.
Listening to smooth jazz, some Kim Scott, some he likes it. He starts looking around.
Cool. Well, we'll get some real flute music in his life soon.
Exactly. Play some Stephen Clark.
Yeah. Well, that's about it. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today. I was just gonna move my camera back to where it was. Yeah, and if y'all want the book, you can get it from any of those stores we just mentioned. Don't be afraid to spend some time in your own personal private flute gym working out those flute muscles, and have a great rest of your Friday.
Thanks for having me, Vic.
All right. Bye-bye, y'all.